Boldwood presents Wicked Girls, written by Heather Atkinson and read by Sarah Barron. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Glasgow, May 1988. Valerie watched her cousin Toni with concern. It was Toni's 12th birthday and she'd been really looking forward to it. But now her party was in full swing. Toni just looked sad. She was wearing the white dress with the bow on the back her mother had purchased after her daughter had begged and pleaded when she'd spotted it in a clothes shop. Now Toni sat slumped on the floor, not caring that her dress was getting creased and crumpled. Both Toni and Valerie were involved in a game of pass the parcel with 5 of Toni's friends and 3 more of their cousins, as well as Toni's 13-year-old brother, Frankie, who wore a gaudy red shell suit that clashed shockingly with his thick mop of ginger hair. Frankie worshipped his sister and never strayed far from her side. Andy, their older brother, sat watching with his mother and stepfather. At 16 years old, he considered himself too mature for such childish games. The rest of the children were laughing, eyes widening with glee every time the parcel came towards them, while Toni merely accepted it with bored indifference before thrusting it at the girl who sat on her right. The music stopped just as it again reached the birthday girl, who rolled her eyes. "Antoinette," said Moira, Toni's mother and Valerie's aunt, "aren't you going to take the paper off?" Toni didn't reply, attacking the wrapping paper, tearing at it with nails that had been painted pink. "You won," commented Valerie when Toni stared impassively down at the pretty pink handbag. "I don't want it," pouted Toni before slinging it into Frankie's lap. She got to her feet and stormed out of the room. "I don't want a fucking handbag," exclaimed Frankie, chucking the item at the girl sitting beside him. "Frankie, language," Moira chided him, pushing back her enormous perm, the fringe of which kept flopping into her eyes, the multicoloured bangles on her wrist clacking together. Valerie looked to her Auntie Moira, who was frowning up at her second husband, Eric. Toni and Frankie's real dad had vanished when Toni was only 7 years old. The rumours about what had happened to him varied according to who you spoke to, but Valerie had overheard her own parents saying he'd left Moira for another woman. "I don't know what's wrong with that little madam lately," commented Moira to her husband. "Nothing we do pleases her. She's spoilt, that's the problem." "I told you no to give in and buy her that dress," replied Eric. "She's had a fortune spent on her lately, and does she appreciate it? Course not." Valerie got up and followed her cousin through the large plush house to the kitchen, where she found Toni pouring herself a glass of orange juice. "Are you okay?" Valerie asked her. "I'm fine," she muttered before taking a swig of juice. "You don't seem it. What's wrong?" "Nothing." "I know that's not true. Please tell me. I might be able to help." Toni's laugh was humourless. "No one can help me." "Has someone hurt you? Is that the problem?" Valerie's worst fears were confirmed when Toni's eyes widened and filled with pain. "If they have," she continued, "you should tell Uncle Roddy. He'll sort them out. He won't let anyone hurt our family." Valerie was a little afraid of the fear that filled Toni's intense dark eyes. She was a beautiful girl with waist-length black curls. Her mother spent hours working on her curls, so they resembled a doll's. "He can't help me," Toni rasped. "Why not? Everyone goes to him for help. He's head of this family. If someone's upset you..." Toni slammed the glass down in the kitchen unit with a shaking hand. "He can't help me. Leave me alone." Valerie was shocked when Toni stormed past her out of the room. They'd been close since they were very young, Toni just 18 months older than Valerie. They were the best of friends and told each other everything, but suddenly Toni was keeping secrets from her, and Valerie couldn't understand why. If their Uncle Roddy couldn't help, then no one could. Unwilling to let the subject drop and allow her cousin and best friend to continue suffering in silence, Valerie went after Toni, who was making for the stairs. She was stopped by her mother calling, "Toni, you've got another visitor. He's brought presents." The prospect of presents would usually have Toni racing to meet them, but this time she sighed and hung her head. "Toni," snapped her mother, warning in her voice. "Come and see your guest." Valerie watched her cousin slink back towards the living room with her head bowed. She followed and saw it was Uncle Roddy himself, arms laden with gifts for his niece. He was a big man, tall and powerfully built, but ugly, with flabby jowls and pock-marked skin. His greying hair was permanently slicked down with gel. "There she is," he beamed at Toni, dumping the presents on the floor and opening his arms to her. "The beautiful wee birthday girl. Come and give Uncle Roddy a hug." "Toni," said Moira, warning in her voice, when her daughter just stood there, "give Uncle Roddy a hug." Valerie saw Toni's reluctance to even approach the man, but she could understand that. Uncle Roddy was the most feared man in Glasgow, as well as one of the wealthiest, and he'd done many bad things to get that wealth. Pretty much every member of the family was afraid of him. But Toni had always been able to wrap him around her little finger by giving him one of her cute dimpled smiles. Now she looked like she didn't want to go anywhere near him. "Toni," hissed Eric, who was starting to look a little nervous, "give your uncle a hug." Unwillingly, the little girl approached Roddy and gave him a brief hug. "That's better," smiled Roddy, patting her back before handing Toni her gifts, which Valerie had no doubt would all be very expensive. He always splashed out on Toni, while the rest of the young cousins got cheap, crappy gifts. Roddy might have been wealthy, but he was tight with it. Valerie was confused. Toni loved receiving gifts, and normally she would have torn into all the shiny paper and bows by now. But she remained sullen and silent, her lower lip sticking out. Moira and Eric appeared a little nervous. "Well, open them then," urged Moira. With a sigh, Toni picked up one of the gifts and reluctantly removed the paper to reveal a beautiful doll with long black curly hair, just like her own. "Oh, it's lovely, Roddy," beamed Moira. "Isn't it, Toni?" "S'pose," muttered the little girl. "Don't be so ungrateful," chided Eric. "Open the rest of the presents." Toni rolled her eyes but sat on the floor to open her gifts, ensuring she sat a good distance from Roddy, who looked on with an indulgent smile. 10 minutes later, Toni was surrounded by more dolls, clothes, jewellery, shoes, and an enormous stuffed bear, while the rest of the children looked on enviously. Any girl would have been delighted by the mountain of presents, but Toni just looked sad and angry. "Say thank you to Uncle Roddy, Toni," said Eric, who was starting to sweat, glancing at the family patriarch as he spoke. "Thank you, Uncle Roddy," said Toni flatly, without looking his way. "You're very welcome," he beamed jovially. "I could murder a bowl of ice cream," he announced. Roddy was famous for his ice cream addiction. "Why don't you get me a bowl, Toni?" "I can do that," said Moira, getting to her feet. "No," barked Roddy, eyes filling with menace. "Toni will do it." When it appeared Moira was going to object again, Roddy's glower became even more ferocious. Moira looked to her husband, who did his best to avoid her gaze, and slowly she retook her seat. The amiable smile returned to Roddy's face as he got to his feet and held his enormous calloused hand out to Toni. "Come on, sweetheart, let's have some birthday ice cream." Toni's eyes met Valerie's, and the latter was shocked by the fear in her cousin's gaze. Obediently, Toni got to her feet, took Roddy's hand, and let him lead her into the kitchen. Valerie moved to follow, wanting to help her cousin, who was obviously in distress. "No, Valerie," snapped Eric, making her jump. She turned to face her uncle. "I want ice cream too." "You'll have to wait until Roddy's finished." "Why?" she frowned. "Because I say so. Just do as you're fucking told." Valerie glanced at Frankie, wondering if he knew what was going on. But even though the boy appeared angry that someone had taken his sister away from him, he knew he had to stay put. "How about a game of musical statues?" said Moira, forcing a smile. "We can't play games without Toni," said Valerie. "It's her party." When Valerie glanced at the closed kitchen door and back at her aunt, she saw Moira was practically sweating with tension. What was going on? "Musical statues it is," said Eric with forced cheer. "Come on, everyone, up you get." He then proceeded to put on some music at an unnecessarily high volume on the hi-fi, making some of the children wince and cover their ears. Valerie had a really bad feeling, just as she had 2 years ago when her dog Gracie had been run over and killed in the street. She glanced at the kitchen door again. Her cousin needed her. Was she just going to stand there and do nothing? If their roles had been reversed, Toni would have battered the door down by now. Just as she'd made up her mind to go in, there was a shriek, followed by an odd gurgle from the direction of the kitchen. Valerie had only heard it over the music because she was standing so close to the kitchen door. "Valerie," snapped Eric, "come away from that door." "Come and join in the fun, sweetheart," said Moira more gently. "I heard a weird noise," she began, pointing at the kitchen door. "I'm sure it's nothing," said Moira with forced cheer, her perm becoming increasingly frazzled by the second. "Now come and join in. We've got prizes to give out," she added as an enticement. Valerie, convinced something terrible was happening to her cousin, was in the grip of panic. "We should check on Toni." "Leave it," barked Eric. "She's fine." His words trailed off as the kitchen door was slowly pushed open, and out walked Toni. Everyone in the room stopped what they were doing to gape at her. Toni's curls were in disarray and her eyes were dead and empty. Her beautiful white dress was spattered with red, as was her face. Valerie's first thought was that she'd shaken the ketchup bottle too hard. That had happened to her once, and it had covered her in sauce. Valerie realised it wasn't ketchup when she saw the large butcher's knife gripped in Toni's hand, which was covered in what Valerie now realised was blood and something disgusting and slimy that looked like skin. Glancing into the kitchen, she saw Roddy's legs sticking out from behind the kitchen table. Moira unleashed an appalled scream, and she and Eric tore into the kitchen, giving Toni a wide berth as they passed. "Oh, God, what's she done?" cried Moira when confronted by the body in the kitchen. Frankie rushed to follow, and Valerie heard him say, "Awesome!" "This is not awesome," exclaimed Eric. "Toni," said Valerie. "Toni," she repeated louder when her cousin stared straight ahead. Finally she got her attention, and Toni's black eyes focused on her. "What happened?" "He wanted me to do something horrible. I said no, but he tried to make me." Toni's grip tightened on the knife. "So I made him stop." Something flickered in Toni's eyes, something Valerie had never seen there before. She might have only been young, but Valerie had seen the look plenty of times in the eyes of her more violent relatives. It was bloodlust. Toni had enjoyed her first kill. Chapter 2, 7 years later. Valerie sighed and glanced at her watch as she waited on the corner of her street for Toni to arrive. Like the majority of the McVay family, Valerie lived in Springburn, a district north of Glasgow city centre, but her street wasn't as nice as those the rest of her family lived on. Her own parents didn't work in the family business and instead had rigidly stuck to the legitimate side of life, even though they could have really used the money. That hadn't stopped Valerie getting involved in the illegal side of the family's activities. Although their business endeavours weren't anywhere near the calibre of what they were when Roddy had been alive, the McVays were still up to their eyes in nefarious activities and ruled the area they occupied. Valerie had resisted at first, although she had been involved in many fights, usually thanks to Toni, who was still her best friend, even all these years later. Toni's natural haughtiness and sense of superiority got a lot of people's backs up, but the cousins had become known as a ferocious team, and most of the locals were now wary of them. Frankie McVay had only added to this wariness as he developed an unnatural interest in his sister, and since becoming famous not only for his savagery, but being a downright lunatic, everybody thought it safer to stay out of Toni's way to avoid arousing his wrath. This wasn't always possible, as Frankie McVay used the flimsiest of excuses to commit violence. A taxi pulled up and the door opened, revealing a long, shapely leg, the foot encased in a black high-heeled shoe. Toni climbed out, her thick black curly hair halfway down her back. She wore a short black skirt, tight white blouse and white fake fur jacket that ended at her waist. From one shoulder hung a black Dior bag. Toni's clothes were all designer, although so far all the fur items she owned were fake. Valerie knew Toni was saving up for a real fur coat, to her cousin's disgust. "Val," smiled Toni as she tossed back her hair and strode up to her with her usual confidence. "I'm glad you're already here. I do hate to be kept waiting." "That's because you're the one who's late," replied Valerie flatly. "I've been standing here for 10 minutes. "The fresh air will do you good," said Toni dismissively. "Yeah, it's a real Garden of Eden around here," said Valerie, taking in all the concrete, cars and council houses. "Are you ready to do this?" "Aye, I am. I've been ready for 10 minutes. Toni sniffed indignantly before striding down the street, her high heels click-clacking off the pavement. Valerie knew she was an attractive woman with a tall, lean figure, long, dark, straight hair that gleamed in the sun, and piercing blue eyes men said were fascinating. But compared to her cousin, she felt like a plain Jane. Toni was always dolled up to the nines and constantly needed to be admired and flattered. Despite her outward confidence, Valerie knew that inwardly Toni needed validation from others to feel worthwhile. The little girl she'd once been, and who had been so traumatised by Roddy McVay and his disgusting perversions, still lived inside Toni. "I'm looking forward to this," said Toni as they walked. "Sandra Jones is a mean old bitch and she deserves a good kicking." "She's not old, she's only 29. "That's fucking ancient." "You'll be that age one day," said Valerie, or at least she hoped her cousin would be. "I won't have let myself go, though. Have you seen her hair? And don't even get me started on her nails. She's also a vicious cow who likes giving her wains a slap and kicking her dog up the arse. That's why I'm helping you with this, no because she doesn't file her nails." "It's worse than that," said Toni. "She bites them too." "Her wains?" "No, her nails. It's disgusting. I hate that." Valerie just smiled and shook her head. Toni really had her priorities backwards. They turned onto the street where Sandra Jones lived, or Sandra Thompson as she was before she got married. The Thompsons lived in Postle Park, just a couple of miles from Springburn, and were long-time rivals of the McVays, their feud dating back to Roddy's time, when a member of the Thompson clan firebombed a taxi rank owned by Roddy, killing his younger brother. The succeeding generations on both sides had maintained that feud, until Frankie had come along and exacerbated the mutual hatred by attacking Jimmy Thompson, the present head of the family. Leaders of the Thompson family never lasted long, dying either violently or from heart disease, easily explained by the vast amount of fried food and alcohol they consumed on a daily basis. A healthy family they were not. Sandra Jones, née Thompson, had moved to Springburn when she'd married a local man and had remained pretty quiet ever since, until she'd incurred Frankie's wrath by mouthing off in the local pubs that her family was going to kill him for constantly telling people he was going to replace Roddy as King of Glasgow. Frankie would have happily smashed Sandra's skull himself, but he was carefully cultivating his hard man image. He thought hammering a woman would make him look like a coward, so he'd sent Toni and Valerie on this errand and promised them £200 each for their trouble. Valerie needed the money to supplement the meagre wage she got from the petrol station she worked at. Toni wanted the money to spend on clothes, makeup, and the expensive beauty salons she frequented. This was something they'd done for Frankie many times before, and everyone in the local area dreaded having the McVay cousins turn up on their doorstep. Toni pushed open the gate leading up to Sandra's home. The rotting wood was clinging on by one rusted hinge and made an ear-piercing shriek as it moved. "Well, that's just announced our arrival," commented Valerie. "A cheap but effective alarm." "It gets worse," said Toni. "Just look at the state of the lawn. I don't think it's been mowed since the Second World War, and the front door looks like it's been kicked in and repaired with gaffer tape." In response, said door was pulled open by Sandra Jones herself, and Toni's lip curling went into overdrive. Sandra was big and beefy, with flabby forearms. Her blonde hair was very thin and lank and hung about her pasty moon face. A cigarette dangled from her thick lips. She wore a white t-shirt with stains down the front and black leggings that were 2 sizes too small. "What the fuck are you pair wanting?" she demanded before taking a drag on her cigarette and blowing the smoke into their faces. Tony's eyes narrowed as she fought the impulse to cough. "Frankie sent us to give you a message." "Oh, aye," Sandra replied cheerfully. "And you 2 wee wains are going to gie it to me, are you?" "We are," said Tony with pleasure, tilting back her head, eyes flashing. "You know, I had a feeling you were going to pull a stunt like this, so I took precautions." Tony arched an eyebrow. "Precautions? You might want to look behind you." Tony and Valerie turned to see a group of 3 men and 1 woman, all Thompsons, walking up the garden path towards them, the man bringing up the rear, tripping over the gate as they went. "Why is nothing ever simple anymore?" sighed Valerie as the 4 people advanced on them. Sandra, for her part, had closed her front door and was watching from the living room window with a smug smile. "What weapons have you got on you?" said Tony, not taking her eyes off the approaching group. Valerie casually checked her pockets. "My house key and a lighter." Tony turned to look at her. "Did you just say your house key?" "Aye," said Valerie, taking it out and inserting it between the index and middle fingers of her right hand. "See?" Tony's response was a raised eyebrow. "No," said Valerie. "It is a bit feeble." "Not if I jab it into someone's eye." "Eyes," breathed Tony. "Perhaps it is a good idea." It was Valerie's turn to raise an eyebrow. Her cousin's eye obsession was downright disturbing when she recalled that Roddy had been stabbed in both eyes. 2 of the men and the woman lunged at them as one, while the final man hung back, as though waiting to gauge which way the fight would go before committing himself. Tony sidestepped as one of the men raised his hand to punch her, and his fist went straight into the brickwork beside the front door of the house. All the blood drained from his face, and he let out an ear-piercing shriek. His obvious agony caused his friends to hesitate, and they stared at him in surprise. The front door was pulled open by Sandra. "Oi, Mark, you dickhead! Watch my pointing!" "I think I've broken my hand!" he screeched, cradling the damaged appendage. "Oh dear, so sad," said Tony with mock sympathy before headbutting him. Mark fell onto his backside, where he decided to remain. "You bitch!" yelled Sandra. "That's my boyfriend." "Then you have my deepest sympathies," smirked Tony. "Hold on, I thought you were married," frowned Valerie. Sandra turned bright red. "Aye, well, fuck off," she retorted. "Claire, get her." The woman who had entered the garden tried to hit Tony, but Tony dodged and punched her in the face. Claire staggered about, stunned, and fell over Sandra's boyfriend. The second man lunged for Valerie, but she jabbed him in the eye with the key. He screamed and clamped a hand over his face. Then Valerie kicked him in the crotch and he fell too. Valerie and Tony looked to the third man, who was staring at them in shock. "Fuck off!" the cousins yelled at him as one. The man jumped and raced out of the garden, tripping over the gate, and rushed down the street. Tony and Valerie turned to face Sandra, who was standing in the doorway, staring at her fallen friends in surprise. "You just made a very big mistake," glowered Tony, as she and Valerie stalked into the house, closing the door behind them. "I can't believe I broke a nail on that bitch's face," sighed Tony, examining her blood-red talons as they left Sandra's house. "You'll live," replied Valerie, who had never painted her nails once in her life, despite how much Tony nagged her to. "I'll have to redo them all now." "Don't make out you're hard done by. Painting your nails is one of your favourite things to do." "There is that," Tony smiled with pleasure. "And Frankie will be pleased. Sandra will think twice about opening her big mouth about anything ever again." "It's always a good day when Frankie's pleased. Do you think he's been getting a wee bit unstable lately?" "He's always been unstable, right from when he started torturing animals when he was a wee wean." "I know, but don't you think it's been getting worse?" "He's just trying to cultivate his hard man image. He doesn't need to cultivate it. Everyone already shites themselves when they see him, especially after what happened when he was 15. Tony's expression turned stony. Don't ever mention that again, Val. Frankie said we've not even to think about it. But Valerie couldn't help think about the fact that Frankie was suspected to have committed his first murder at 15 years old. A local man had been found stabbed to death in an alleyway. He'd hit Frankie for stealing a jacket and some money from his taxi when he'd parked it outside his own home to nip in for something to eat during his shift. It hadn't even been a hard hit, just a clip around the ear. But it had driven Frankie into a frenzy, and he'd sworn revenge, although he'd been very careful to only mention this to his family. Frankie was far from stupid. When the man's body had been found, they'd all known he was responsible, but no one had said a word. That was the day Moira McVay became terrified of both her children. She'd feared Tony after she'd stabbed Roddy and was afraid her daughter would want to punish her for not protecting her from that monster. But when Frankie became a killer too, Moira felt trapped with two murderers to raise alone. She'd divorced Eric when he'd been imprisoned for attempted rape of a teenage girl. With Roddy's death, the money had dried up and they'd had to move to a smaller house. The family always made sure Moira had enough to maintain her current, cheaper lifestyle, but they would disown her if she walked out on her kids. They would cut off all financial support and she'd be an outcast, forced to leave Glasgow, the only home she'd ever known. Moira was trapped. "What do you think Frankie will become if he gets all the power he's after?" said Valerie. "Rich," smiled Tony with satisfaction. "I was thinking more of a despot. No one will be safe." "Stop talking like this. It's dangerous. It's true and you know it." Tony huffed and rounded on her. "I mean it, Val. I don't want anything to happen to you, so fucking stop it, okay?" Valerie was well aware that she was one of the very few people Tony cared about, and she was afraid of losing her. "All right, Tony, if that's what you want." "It is," she hissed. Tony sighed, her expression softening. "Bad things happen to people who criticise Frankie." "I know," Valerie replied, equally gently, touched by how worried her cousin was for her. "Well, let's go and tell him our mission was successful. That'll put us in his good books." A relieved Tony smiled and nodded. "That's the best place to be." Frankie had moved into his own house just a couple of streets away from his mother's. After battering a couple of low-level drug dealers and scaring them off, he'd taken over their patches and was doing very well for himself. So well, in fact, that he'd been able to rent a nice terraced house. The McVay family once again ruled Springburn, but they had barely any influence outside their own neighbourhood, which was a big come-down from Roddy's day when they'd ruled the entire city. Frankie could have afforded to buy his home outright, but that kind of money would have drawn the police's attention to him immediately. It was a small house, just a 2-up, 2-down, but Frankie was immensely proud of it. Because he was raking in so much cash dealing weed, cocaine and heroin, he'd filled it with only the best furniture. No flat-packed shite that took a whole day to assemble. It was spotlessly clean, as he paid one of his mother's friends to clean it for him. He rarely had people round, but he didn't mind Tony visiting because he was obsessed with her, and he didn't mind Valerie because she could be trusted not to make a mess. Tony rang the bell and they waited for it to be answered. Tony became increasingly uncomfortable when the door didn't open, but she knew her brother was staring at her through the spy hole. She could practically feel his eyes eating up her body, and it made her feel sick. Finally, the door opened to reveal Frankie, wearing black trousers and a light blue shirt. Since his elevation in the world, he'd taken to wearing only expensive suits. As he was just hanging around the house, he wasn't wearing a tie and suit jacket, but he still liked to look smart, even if he wasn't going anywhere. On his feet, he wore grey slippers. Shoes were not permitted inside his home. Valerie always thought it was funny that the feared Frankie McVay wore grandad slippers, but she never mentioned the fact. "It's yourselves," he grinned at them. "Come away in." Frankie's appearance hadn't changed since he was a young boy. He still had his thick red hair and the square black-framed glasses, only his hair was now a little more styled and never permitted to become unruly. After leaving their shoes just inside the door, Valerie and Toni were allowed to pad through to the living room, which contained an enormous brown leather sofa, a coffee table made of gleaming oak, an extravagant sideboard of the same material, and the newest television and hi-fi money could buy. "How did it go?" said Frankie. "Did you sort out that ugly old bitch?" "We did," said Toni proudly. "Did she give you any bother?" "She tried. 4 of her pals were there, but we dealt with them easily enough, didn't we, Val?" "Aye," she replied. "No bother." "Fucking beautiful," said Frankie. He delved into the drawer of the sideboard and produced 2 balled-up rolls of notes, tossing one to each of the women. "Enjoy spending it. You deserve it." "Thanks, Frankie," they replied in unison before slipping the money into their pockets. "I've got another job for you if you're up for it." "What job?" said Toni. Valerie warily awaited his response. She was always afraid Frankie would ask them to deal drugs for him. Her conscience had no problem with giving someone a good hiding, but she balked at the prospect of selling drugs. "I want you to keep an eye on Stevie Johnson for me," said Frankie. "That wee shite is getting too lady for his own good, and I think he might be relaying information about me to the fucking Thompsons." "Wee Stevie," said Toni. "Are you sure?" "No, I'm no sure. That's why I want you to watch the bastard," he barked. "Aye, all right then, Frankie, we will," she said in a soothing tone. "You got a problem with that doll?" he asked Valerie. "Not at all," she replied in her usual cool, calm way. Valerie knew it annoyed Frankie that she never seemed to be frightened of him. The truth was, she was afraid of him. She just didn't let it show. "Aye, good," he said with a sharp nod, eyes flashing at the fact that once again his anger had seemingly failed to intimidate her. "The problem is, the wee worm's gone to ground, so you'll need to sniff him out first. Do the job right and you'll get double the pay. You might even start earning enough to gie up your shitey job at the petrol station." "I enjoy that job," replied Valerie. "I meet some interesting people." "You mean wankers? Well, on you go then, and let me know the moment you find out if Stevie's a treacherous wee prick." The 2 women put their shoes back on and left, Toni breathing a sigh of relief that she was out of her brother's company. "We'd better get right on with finding Stevie, I suppose," said Valerie. "Definitely," replied Toni. "If Frankie tells you to do something, then you do it. If we keep doing so well, soon we'll both be working for him full time." Valerie wasn't sure that was what she wanted, but she wasn't about to tell Toni that. She didn't want to think what Frankie would do if he found out. Chapter 3. Stevie Johnson was a small, unpleasant creature, with greasy hair, spots, and perpetual stains under the armpits of his tracksuit. However, he was popular in the local community because Stevie always knew what was happening, who was having an affair with who was up in court, who was in debt with the local loan sharks. If there was something you wanted to know, Stevie Johnson was your man. Naturally, Frankie had recruited him to assist in his rise to power. An information gatherer of Stevie's calibre was a very valuable asset. But he could be equally damaging if he decided to turn on his master, which was why Frankie needed to find out if he was a traitor ASAP. "Why is he sending us out on this?" Valerie asked Toni. "Because he thinks we can handle it," she replied. "Frankie hates traitors. I would have thought he'd want to deal with it himself. Or what about his friends Paul and Jamesy? They're his main enforcers." "Aye, they are, but they don't have too many brain cells," said Toni with an amused smile. "They'd get distracted and end up getting pished in the pub." "I'm not so sure. I think there's more to it." "You're getting paranoid. Frankie knows we're the best ones for the job. End of story." But Valerie's instinct was nagging at her, so she would stay on guard. They went to Stevie's home, but he wasn't there, which meant a trek around every pub, bookies and cafe in Springburn. But he was nowhere to be found, and everyone they spoke to said they had no idea where he was. Valerie and Toni stopped in a cafe to have a cup of tea and go over their options. "I'll make that wee sod Stevie pay when we do find him," sighed Toni. slipping off her left shoe and massaging her foot. "It's his fault my feet are aching." "You'd be much more comfortable in trainers," commented Valerie. Tony's eyes flashed. "I have never worn trainers and I'm no starting now." "Actually, I remember you having a blue pair with ET on the heels when you were wee. You loved them, and you used to run around thinking if you ran fast enough, you'd take off into the sky like Elliot's bike." Tony's eyes narrowed. "Don't ever mention that again." Valerie chuckled and sipped her tea. "When we do find Stevie," said Tony, "I'll kick him right in the balls. He's playing it smart. We just have to be smarter. Where would he hide? With one of his manky pals, probably. But he wouldn't risk letting anyone else know, not with how persuasive Frankie can be." Good point. Well, we know he doesn't have any second properties or island hideaways," said Tony with an amused smile. "Maybe he's booked into some cheap bed and breakfast." "He wouldn't fork out for something like that. He's known for being a miserly git. Every penny's a prisoner with him." Tony's eyes gleamed as she finally scented their quarry. "Then he's somewhere that's free and no one else will be there." "Are you thinking the flats on Balgrey Hill Road, which were abandoned after that fire?" "That is one possibility. Jeannie Warren's Wayans have started saying it's haunted and that no one should go near it because the ghost will get angry and follow them home. I wonder if this ghost is 5'8", smelly and ugly. I think it just might be. What better way to keep the Wayans away than scare them with a ghost story? Let's check it out." They finished their tea and, feeling revived, the two women continued the hunt. The flats were only a few streets away, so Tony's sore feet didn't have to walk far. "I'll be needing my foot spa tonight," she announced, grimacing when pain shot through the ball of her foot every time her shoe made contact with the pavement. She soothed herself by thinking of all the tortures she would inflict on wee Stevie for sending her on this merry dance. The flats were a 5-storey dark cream building, relatively modern, but made grotesque by being left to decay after the fire. All the windows on the top 2 floors were boarded up. Some of the windows on the lower floors, which hadn't been as badly damaged by the fire, had been smashed by teenagers using the debris lying on the ground, abandoned bottles, bricks and stones. A window on the first floor had been left open, and the tattered curtain still hanging from the rail flapped in the breeze, making the building a sad parody of the life that had once inhabited it. All the doors at the front of the building had been boarded up, but they found one at the rear that had been prized open. Valerie peered through the crack in the door. The interior was gloomy, but she could make out a bare corridor, scorch marks up the wall, graffiti sprayed across it. The tiled floor was bare and chipped, but there was no sign of life. "I can't see anyone," she whispered to Tony. "Shall we check it out?" Quietly they crept through the gap in the door, Tony walking on her tiptoes to avoid making a sound on the tiled floor with her heels. Her lip curled at the smell, which was a mixture of mustiness, urine and smoke. Together they poked their heads around the first door on the left. The building was split into small, poky flats. This particular flat was entirely bare, the remnants of fire-damaged furniture the only thing it contained. The other 3 flats on this level were the same, so they made their way up to the first floor, being careful to avoid all the gouges in the concrete steps. It was impossible to keep their approach silent because of Tony's high heels and all the creaks and groans the building made as they moved through it. Valerie was beginning to wonder at the wisdom of venturing inside, especially as signs adorned the exterior of the building, warning that it was unsafe. Just as they reached the top of the stairs, there was a loud banging sound, followed by an eerie groan. "Get out!" snarled a ferocious voice. "If that's a ghost," said Tony, "then I'm Peter Andre." The 2 women strode down the corridor towards the room where the voice had come from, as the groan increased in volume, accompanied by the rattling of chains. "Seriously?" said Valerie with a raised eyebrow. "On 3, smiled Tony. Valerie smiled back and nodded. They counted down together before kicking the door, which slammed open and hit something before rebounding. There was another groan, only this time it was one of pain. Valerie and Toni walked in to find a small, sweaty, spotty man moaning on the floor, blood trickling from his nose. Beside him on the floor lay a thick bike chain. "Oh, look, Val," said Toni. "We caught a wee ghost." "So it seems," she replied. "I think you broke my nose," whined Stevie. "So you're the one who's been haunting this building," said Toni. "You got the way in scared." "Good. That's what I wanted. We sods kept trying to come in to arse about," he replied, voice pinched and nasal. "But you didn't want them here, did you? Because you were using this place as your hidey hole after betraying my brother." "I didn't betray him," exclaimed Stevie. "That's a malicious rumour. Someone's got it in for me, someone who wants to see Frankie fail." Toni knelt beside him, produced a small knife from her jacket pocket, and brandished it with glee. "Now, who would do that?" "There's plenty of people who don't want him to succeed." "Like who?" "The Thompsons, for one, but I haven't betrayed him. I wouldn't, I swear," he cried. "He scares the living shite out of me." "I do hope you're not lying to me," said Toni, pressing the tip of the blade to his lower eyelid, fascinated by the way the eyeball protruded a little when she put pressure on the lid. One day, she'd go all the way and see if she could get someone's eyeball to pop out entirely. But she couldn't do that to Stevie, not without Frankie's permission anyway. "Careful, Toni," said Valerie. "You'll hurt him. You'd better call Frankie." To Valerie's relief, the knife disappeared back into the depths of Toni's coat, and her cousin got to her feet. "You're right, Val. He'll want to handle this personally." Toni produced a chunky green Nokia phone. "I hate these fucking things," she muttered as she tapped at the buttons, sighing when she pressed the wrong one and it beeped. "Finally, there it is." She put the phone to her ear, and Frankie answered on the second ring. "We've found him." After giving Frankie the address, she hung up and looked down at the hapless Stevie. "He's on his way." "He's gonna fucking kill me and I haven't done anything wrong," he wailed. "You made yourself look guilty by going into hiding," Valerie told him. "You should have gone to him instead and explained." "Explained to Frankie McVay? He would have slit my throat before I'd said a word because he already thinks I'm guilty even though I'm no. You have to help me, please, or I'll die in this shithole." "Then give us more information. What's going on?" "I don't know." "Oh, yes, you do. You always know what's going on, Stevie, and it seems that knowledge has landed you right in it." Stevie dragged himself up to a sitting position and sighed. "The Thompsons are feared that Frankie will become a power, especially after all the bad blood that went on between them and your family when Roddy was alive. They think he'll want revenge. They also know that I'm one of his biggest assets, and by setting me up, they're hoping he'll take me out himself, not only weakening him, but making him look like a dickhead in the process." "Frankie will be the one to judge you," said Toni. "He'll kill me," bawled Stevie, tears shining in his eyes. Toni shrugged. She couldn't care less. Valerie felt sorry for Stevie as he remained slumped on the floor, quietly crying. At one point, he tried to make a run for it, but Toni stuck out her foot and tripped him, and he fell face down on the dusty floor, where he remained, limp with defeat, until Frankie strode in with his two best friends, Paul and Jamesy. Paul was tall and stocky, with round glasses, dark hair, and a goatee beard. Jamesy was scrawny-looking, with dirty blonde hair that stuck out at odd angles from his head. He looked perpetually rumpled, as though he'd just got out of bed and dressed in a hurry. Frankie's lip curled with disgust in a way very reminiscent of his sister as he stared down at Stevie pitilessly. "Stop fucking crying, you big Jessie," he thundered. Stevie went abruptly silent, but remained on the floor with his head bowed, unable to bring himself to look at Frankie. Frankie, breathing furiously, knelt by Stevie's side, grabbed a handful of his hair and yanked up his head. "Have you betrayed me to the Thompsons?" "No, Frankie, I swear. They're lying because they know that I'll only work for you. They tried to get me to go over to their side, but I told them to piss off, and this is their revenge." Frankie looked to Paul and Jamesy, who shrugged, before he turned back to face Stevie. "What a load of Bollocks, he spat at him. It's the truth, cried Stevie. I don't believe you. Frankie's eyes rolled back in his head, a sign that his anger had reached its peak and he could no longer control it. Stevie screamed in fear when Frankie pulled a machete from inside his long black coat and raised it aloft. "Frankie!" yelled a voice. The interruption had the desired effect. Frankie's eyes returned to normal and he turned to look at Valerie. "What?" he barked, the machete still raised. "I think he's telling the truth." "Thank you," breathed Stevie, tears rolling down his face and his hands shaking uncontrollably. "This is down to the Thompsons," said Valerie calmly, ignoring Tony's frantic gestures to stop talking. "They're stirring things up so you'll take out one of your biggest assets." Frankie slowly lowered the machete, his gaze riveted on her. "You think the Thompsons are smart enough to come up with a plan like that?" "I do, and I think you should at least check it out before condemning Stevie. He gathers all your intelligence for you. Without him you'll be blind, which is what the Thompsons want." Frankie appeared thoughtful, the mania gone from his eyes. "That's some good thinking, Val. I won't let the Thompsons manipulate me, the sly bastards. All right, Stevie boy, you've had a reprieve." "Thank you," the man rasped, still shaking uncontrollably. "But until I know for sure that you're no a backstabbing wee worm, you'll live in my cellar. That way I know you can't do a runner." Stevie was just so relieved all his body parts were still attached that he didn't object to being kept a prisoner. "I want you two to check it out," said Frankie, pointing from Valerie to Tony with the machete. "Us?" said Tony. "But I thought you'd put Paul and Jamesy on it." "This pair of daft wanks. You must be joking. Jamesy can't find his arse with both hands, and Paul walked into the cupboard instead of the cludgy in his own hoose. How do you expect them to deal with something complex like this?" Neither of Frankie's friends took offence, and instead just smiled with amusement, glad they hadn't been given that assignment, because it would be a difficult one to get to the bottom of, and Frankie hated failure. "Don't get sulky," Frankie barked at his sister. "I'll pay you £1,000 each if you find out what's going on." "£1,000?" said Tony, eyes gleaming as she thought of all the clothes and shoes she could buy with that money. "All right, we'll do it." Valerie scowled at her, but Tony ignored the look. Frankie wrapped his arm around his sister, causing her to stiffen. "I knew you wouldn't let me down, sweetheart." He planted a wet kiss on her cheek, Tony doing her best not to grimace. "You too," said Frankie, releasing Tony and nodding at his friends, while slipping the machete back inside his jacket. "Get that spotty wee prick to my house. Make sure he's locked up nice and tight in my cellar." "On it, Frankie," said Paul, easily hauling Stevie to his feet by one arm. Jamesy took his other arm, and between them they escorted him out. Stevie nodded his thanks at Valerie as he passed her by, and she nodded back. "I want results, and I want them fast," Frankie told Valerie and Tony so severely they didn't dare object, not after he'd already been denied his fun. The two women nodded and Frankie left too, complaining about the smell as he went. "Great," sighed Valerie. "Where the hell are we supposed to start?" "Just keep thinking of the money," said Tony. "That's what's consoling me." "Not me. I just wanted to help Stevie. I couldn't watch him being hacked to pieces in this horrible place. Your problem is you've got too much compassion. Good, because the day I lose it is the day I give up entirely. That's a bit dramatic. I mean it. What will we become if we continue down this road?" "Rich," was Tony's response. "There are many ways to be rich, not just materialistically." "Aye, but that's the most fun." Tony rolled her eyes when Valerie stared at her stonily. "Fine, we won't do it, but you can tell Frankie. I'm sure he'll find an imaginative way to show you how disappointed he is." It was Valerie's turn to sigh. "We've no choice. Not if we want to stay in one piece, no. Where do we start? We'll need to find out what the Thompsons know about Frankie's operation. The Thompsons will probably expect him to make a move, but they won't be expecting him to send 2 women. That gives us the advantage. But they know our faces. They'll see us coming a mile off." Tony paused to think before saying, "Let's go to that club on Queen Street. Not our chaos, groaned Valerie. That's the one. What's wrong with our chaos? I don't like nightclubs at the best of times, but that one's mental. They let in anyone, no matter how slaughtered they are. Well, it's where the Thompson brothers like to go, so suck it up, Val. We're taking a walk on the wild side. Valerie tutted. And dress up a bit, won't you? We'll need to look like we're out on the town, not going for an interview at a building society. Valerie looked down at her black trousers, white t-shirt and black blazer. Are you saying my clothes are boring? Aye, I am. You're so pretty and you don't make the most of yourself. Because I don't need to rely on my looks. I have other qualities to see me through life. Only ugly people say that, and you're not ugly. I'll lend you something of mine. Tony's favoured animal prints and fake furs were not to Valerie's taste. No need. I've got a nice little black dress I can wear. Will that do you? Don't you have any colours? There's my pink and yellow shell suit. She smiled at Tony's appalled look. My little black dress doesn't seem so bad now, does it? Chapter 4. Valerie winced as the hard, fast music pulsated through the huge circular main room of our chaos, its coloured walls only adding to the bedlam. As usual, the club was hot and packed. Toni was in her element, preening herself at the admiring looks she was getting in her tight, low-cut white dress that barely covered her bottom, her bare legs long and supple, the outfit completed by a pair of killer black high heels. Even though she felt a plain Jane in comparison to her cousin, Valerie was getting looks too, but she didn't revel in them like Toni did. We'll never find them in here, Valerie told Toni, having to yell in her ear to be heard. The club was definitely overcrowded. People were bouncing around the room to the music. Others had chosen to dance on tables, one of them tipping up and sending the revellers to the floor in a rattle of spilt drinks and broken glasses. Let's try upstairs, replied Toni, gesturing to the gantry above their heads that looked down on the dance floor. It'll give us a better view. They wove in and out of the revellers towards the stairs, Valerie glaring at one man who pinched her bottom. At the top of the stairs, they found themselves a spot on the gantry where they could look down on the main dance floor, but it was still a hopeless confusion of people. We should try the VIP room, Toni yelled in Valerie's ear. They'll never let us in. They only want footballers, page 3 girls and actors. It's worth a try. OK, sighed Valerie wearily. She didn't have a better suggestion and she wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. They climbed more stairs towards the VIP room, which was known as the Sky Bar. At the door, they were stopped by security. Toni stuck out her bosom and flicked back her hair for all she was worth, but nothing would encourage the doorman to allow them to pass. Both men received the full force of Toni's shark-like, black-eyed glare, and despite being hard men, they were unnerved, sensing something wasn't quite right with this beautiful young woman. The Thompsons probably aren't in there anyway, said Valerie, linking her arm through Toni's and encouraging her away before she stuck the small knife she'd secreted in her handbag into one of the men. No way would they let them in. I don't give a shite about them, spat Toni. No one stops me from going where I want. Nobody, she hissed. One day, everyone will fear me and they won't dare get in my way. I fucking swear it. I've no doubt they will, said Valerie gently. The rage cleared from Toni's eyes. Let's try Bonkers on Hope Street. They might be there. Valerie sighed. That place was even crazier than our chaos. Every loon in Glasgow frequented that club. It was named Bonkers for a reason. Or Destiny, added Toni, who loved clubbing. They're having a foam party tonight. I thought you hated foam parties because they ruin your hair. They do, but they're still fun. If Frankie gets wind that we're enjoying ourselves rather than working, he won't be impressed. Why don't we try the Thompsons' local pub instead? We'll have more chance of spotting them there than a nightclub. Aye, all right. On their way to the pub, the two women passed another nightclub, one that was known for being a gay club. Valerie stopped and tugged at Toni's arm. What? Frowned Toni. Valerie pointed sideways at the queue waiting to get into the club, and Toni's lips curled with malicious pleasure. Well, I wasn't expecting that. They stalked up to the man they'd spotted, who was doing his best to look inconspicuous, standing with his shoulders hunched and head bowed. "Tommy Thompson," said Tony loudly. The man jumped and turned to look at them, appalled when he saw two of his family's enemies standing there. "What the hell are you pair wanting?" he demanded. "We just need a quiet word," said Tony. "Piss off. If you don't come with us, we'll go to the pub down the road and tell your family you're waiting to get into a gay club." Although it was dark, they could still see Tommy pale at the prospect. His family was notoriously homophobic, as well as racist. "What do you want to talk to me about?" he said in a voice tight with nerves. "Not here," said Tony. "There's a decent all-night cafe on the next street. We'll discuss it there." Tommy reluctantly left the queue and followed the two women to the cafe, slinking along behind them with his hands shoved into his pockets, glad it was dark, hoping no one would see him with them. A light drizzle had started, bringing with it a chilly breeze. Valerie was glad she'd decided to wear a jacket over the dress. She looked at Tony, whose body spilled out of her clingy dress, but she was completely unaffected by the cold. It had to be snowing for Tony to notice a chill in the air. The windows of the cafe had steamed up from the condensation, which was a relief to Tony because it reduced the chances of anyone seeing him with a couple of McVays. He hunched at a table in the corner, mumbling an order for a cup of tea when the waitress approached in a stained apron. He was a handsome man of 22 with sandy hair and pretty light green eyes. "What's wrong, Tommy?" said Tony, eyes dancing. "Afraid of being seen with us in public?" "Aye," he muttered. "My family will fucking kill me." "Then answer us truthfully, and this excruciating experience will be over quickly. Now, have your family set up poor Stevie Johnson?" "Set him up?" he frowned. "How?" "Put it about that he betrayed Frankie." "Betrayed him how?" "It's me asking the questions, no you," growled Tony, pointing a digit at him. "So, has your family set him up?" "Not that I know of, but they don't tell me anything." "Oh, aye? Keep you on the fringes, do they?" "Are you a bit thick, Tommy?" "No," he retorted. "I'm done with this. I'm out of here." "I don't think so," said Tony, whipping the knife out of her handbag and pressing it to his thigh under the table. "Not unless you want this shoving into your femoral artery." "You wouldn't," replied Tommy with a nervous laugh. "No in a public place. The police would easily catch you." "The problem is, Tommy, that Frankie sent me and Val to get some answers, and he's far more scary than any police. So I will spill your blood all over this nasty stained floor if it gets us the answers we want." "She's being serious," Valerie told Tommy. "So just tell us what we want to know and we'll be on our way." "I really don't know anything." He winced when the tip of Tony's knife bit into the cloth of his trousers. "I'm telling the truth," he rasped. "You really chose the wrong person to speak to. I don't get involved in all my family's crap. I just want a quiet life. If you want answers, you need to talk to my cousin Liam. He knows everything that's going on in our family." "Where can we find him?" said Valerie. "In Destiny. He loves that club." Tony and Valerie looked at each other and nodded. "All right, Tommy," said Tony. "We'll try Liam, but if you're messing us about, we'll come back and cut your cock off." Tommy gasped with relief when Tony retracted the knife. After Tony and Valerie had left, Tommy took out his phone. "Liam, all right, mate," he said into the Nokia. "I've sent a couple of presents your way. Toni McVay and our cousin Valerie." "Aye, have fun," he added before hanging up. It was only when the waitress returned to the table with 3 cups of tea that Tommy realised he'd been stuck with a bill.